moving.
A major challenge we face in America is that we have so politicized events. A simple remark like "it's really cold today" can be seen as a position on climate change. But if we can't disengage our political passions, then we cannot disengage from the biases they bring. We cannot distinguish between who is really honest or really dishonest. And that makes it nearly impossible to make good decisions. The Affordable Care Act is a clear example of a problem most of us didn't fully understand, because until insurance policies started canceling, the conversation was purely political. Nick and I would like to illustrate how this law was misrepresented and why it is illegal in many ways that have not been tested. But more importantly, we want to use the passage of this law to understand why it is so important that we as a nation think beyond political allegiances and begin to work together in harmony. The Affordable Care Act is not merely an example of government helping the poor to gain health care. Nor is the rejection of the Affordable Care Act a rejection of this president, this Congress, or any political party. It is a repudiation of the very foulest use of raw power by too many politicians, and a testament to our own lack of true political understanding. Here are just 3 examples of the many falsehoods that were told to sell the Affordable Care Act. Number 1, we were told that the act was needed to stop insurers from arbitrarily canceling coverage for people who get sick. Yet this was blatant deceit. Congress had already passed a 1996 law that stopped precisely this. All that was necessary was to enforce it. Secondly, we were told the Affordable Care Act would lower costs for the average family by $2,500 a year. But the assumptions used to arrive at this number were so contrived they were labeled unlikely by the CBO even before the law was passed. According to the chief actuary for Medicare and Medicaid, average family premiums will now rise faster than had the government done nothing. And these premiums do not even count the additional taxes that most people, including the poor, must now pay. And the third, as millions of Americans now know, under the Affordable Care Act, they cannot keep their policies if they like them, nor in many cases even their doctors or their hospitals. What you may not know is that it was the President's own administration that wrote the changes in the law that caused these cancellations. They appeared in the Federal Register 90 days after the act was signed. In fact, the Federal Register in June 2010 contained estimates that up to 90 million Americans could lose their coverage because of those administration changes. In June 2010, the Senate introduced S.R. 39 to reduce the cancellations. It was voted down. The President of the United States, every single Republican and every single Democrat in the U.S. Senate knew that millions of people would lose their health plans 3 years ago. While Washington is known for spin, it is the ease and magnitude of this deception that is disturbing. At the very time the President was assuring Americans their policies were grandfathered, he had already instructed his officials in the Department of Treasury, the IRS, and Health and Human Services to write the regulations that undid that protection. With his signature charismatic style, Mr. Obama continued to woo Americans with the same unequivocal lies right up until September 2013, just days before the cancellations he instigated began. But this is only a small portion of the intentional distortions and misrepresentations used to market the Affordable Care Act. It is possible that the authors of the act believed in what they were doing so passionately that the truth didn't matter. But regardless of their motives, Americans were sold a costly bait-and-switch product using tactics that, if we tried, would land many of us in prison. Perhaps worse than the lies told to sell the Affordable Care Act is the realization that this law is the product of illegal actions that affect the very foundation of our legal system. And here's Nick to explain a little about this.
Thank you, John. Thank you again. Most Americans are beginning to realize how badly the Affordable Care Act was misrepresented. What you may not know is that the race to write and pass this law, Congress committed numerous acts of fraud that only invalidate the act. They could lead to prosecution. Here's one example. Article 1, Section 7 of the Constitution says, only the House of Representatives can originate a bill. That raises revenue. Let me make this clear. Any revenue bill that is not originated in the House of Representatives automatically is null and void. Now, the Supreme Court ruled that the administration agreed Affordable Care Act raises tax revenues. The problem is the bill didn't originate in the House. Here's what happened. The original health care bill, H.R. 3290, passed by the House, was rejected in its entirety by the Senate. They formed the Baucus Committee and wrote their own bill. Now think about that. The Senate did not rework a House bill. They wrote their own. Normally, the next step would have been to send the bill to the House where it would be rewritten, then resubmit it to the Senate as a House-originated bill. But this takes time. That's when the trouble started, because suddenly there was no time. No one expected Scott Brown to win the seat in Massachusetts and give the Republicans enough votes to filibuster and stop this new bill when it came back to the Senate. Since the bill now had to pass before Brown was seated and sworn in, Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid circumvents the legal process and took an old House bill, H.R. 3590, the Service Members Homeowners Tax Act of 2009. They erased the title. They pull out the entire contents and swap it out and insert the Senate's bill, creating the illusion of a health care bill originating in the House because of the House designation number. More than invalidating the entire health care law, once proven in court, both Ms. Pelosi and Mr. Reid could be criminally prosecuted, renaming a Veterans Bill the Affordable Care Act, then hijacking a pre-existing House designation number with fraudulent intent to deceive the public and skirt the Constitution is a strong case for prosecution. Fraudulent deception was perpetrated on all Americans, members of the Democrat Party, Republican Party, and every attorney involved in a multi-state lawsuit against the ACA knew the Senate's inability to legally pass a bill that raised revenues. So far, the Supreme Court has not heard this case on the violation, but prosecution is closer than you may think. You see, Judge Rogers Vincent from the District Court in Florida has already ruled the Affordable Care Act was written in the Senate, not the House. Here are a few more violations we have found. ACA was based upon the Constitution General Welfare Clause, which means it must benefit everyone. But it takes money from one group to pay for another. This is specific welfare. And according to the Supreme Court in Butler versus United States, it's completely illegal. First Amendment of the Constitution forbids Congress to make laws that respect one religion over another. But the ACA Act does precisely that. When it exempts Muslims from participation in the act, yet forces Christians and Jews to go against their beliefs and pay for abortions, which Obama said would not happen. But the Affordable Care Act, when you look at it and you keep going, gives the government, under the Fourth Amendment, right to search and seizure. What? Do you think that's bad? The government has broad access to your private bank accounts and personal information, and that ability to confiscate your property for non-payment of health care-related charges. Worse, you cannot challenge this in any court because the right to legal trial is suspended throughout this law in every provision. HIPAA legislation is meant to keep your personal health information private, yet the ACA requires interagency sharing of your personal data to the extent that thousands of people will now have access. And finally, the 14th Amendment. Guess what? It guarantees all Americans to receive equal protection and equal treatment under the law, but by granting waivers to congressional staffers, community groups, select corporations, unions, the Affordable Care Act violates this provision. These are only a few examples of the illegalities in the Affordable Care Act. For 3 years, I have put forth the challenge to all law professors, judges, and attorneys to prove me wrong. No one has yet been able to do so. The office still stands. John, would you continue, please?
Thank you, Nick. The rank corruption that we see in the Affordable Care Act does not start or stop with a political party. It starts and stops with people. It is time for all Americans to work together and demand that public officials stop the lies and undo the violations that erase our basic personal protections. I urge you to forward this presentation to everyone you know. In this presentation, we have only scratched the surface of the Affordable Care Act. In the next, you will learn how the law progressively removes more and more rights while grabbing ever-increasing tax dollars from those who can least afford it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.